I'm so happy to welcome today to the Audio Garden author Doug Tallamy, also professor at the University of Delaware. He's the author of Bringing Nature Home, The Nature of Oaks, Nature's Best Hope, and the co founder of Homegrown National Park. And I think kind of a YouTube superstar amongst native plant societies around the country, which is how I first discovered you, Doug. Welcome to Listen and Be Heard Hour for readers and writers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I have been reading The Nature of Oaks. And one thing I appreciate about it is that it's written by each chapter name is a month of the year. And it kind of invited me to slow down on the reading of this book and perhaps just examine each chapter as the year unfolds, sort of in tree time, I guess you could say. Um, uh, Oaks are
Right.
keystone um, species. Maybe we could start with talking about why the nature of oaks is so supremely important for us all to understand.
Well, the keystone species concept comes from what a keystone is in that Roman arch. It's that stone in the middle of the arch, and if you take it out of the arch collapses. So, if you take keystone species out of their ecosystem, the ecosystem is transformed, usually in a very negative way. In terms of oak's contribution, they're supporting more biodiversity, um, more other creatures than just about any other tree species or tree genus in North America, anyway. So if you remove them from an ecosystem, you've really devastated the diversity of life in that ecosystem. They're particularly important in terms of supporting caterpillars, and caterpillars are particularly important in terms of supporting birds during the breeding season and many other things. They're known as the bread and butter of terrestrial ecosystems. So if you have plants that make a lot of caterpillars, then you have a very diverse ecosystem. Just to give you a brief example, it takes 6 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. So we need plants that make a lot of caterpillars if we're going to have
Would it
breeding
be
birds.
fair to say, I was trying to imagine, so say I have a few acres and I have all kinds of plant diversity there, but no oak. Would it be fair to say probably that one oak tree might provide more than all those other species combined on a couple acres of land?
Depends on what those other species are. If those other species are other native plants, oaks are not the only keystone plant. Willows are important, cherries are important, birches are important. But if most of the other species in your yard are ornamental plants from Asia, then that would easily be true. So things like crepe myrtle and ginkgo, burning bush, they're supporting almost no species. So again, it depends on the species that you're talking about, but oaks are the best uh, contributors in 84% of the counties in which they occur. They don't
But
belong
they
in
do
all
belong
ecosystems,
in
but where they
a
do belong,
major
they're really important.
portion of our ecosystem in North America. Is correct.
Yeah, they're not important in the northern Rockies or in the high dry plains, but
Okay.
otherwise,
And
yes.
so it's October. And I imagine, we have listeners on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in Iowa and New Mexico. What would people be trying to observe this time of year, if they actually are aware of the oak trees that are present around them?
The most obvious thing about oaks in October is their production of acorns. We're actually in mid October, so acorns have pretty much dropped at this point. But people often notice, well, gee, this was a year where there were a lot of acorns or not very many acorns. And when there's a lot of acorns, it's called a mast year, and it only happens once every 2, 3, 4 years. When there's a little, very few acorns, we don't call it anything. But that type of reproduction is, it's very asynchronous and it's unusual in plants. Um, so there's a number of hypotheses about why oaks are doing that, but that's the thing that people are going to notice the most. Those acorns, each one of those acorns is a really important package of food for an awful lot of animals. A number of birds, the big birds, turkeys, the small birds, jays, um, the big mammals, bears depend on acorns to make it through the winter. So it's one of the most important contributions that oaks make, and that's what you're going to notice
And
in
so
October.
here where I am in Greenville, South Carolina, and we're also heard up in Asheville, North Carolina, we had um, a, a storm that nobody would have even thought would happen here. And now I'm driving around and I see trees piled up in the ditches. And I've actually received probably 5 loads of wood chips from various arborists who are cleaning up behind the storm. I wonder what you might say about, the state of oaks in this situation and what might be the best way to utilize fallen oak trees.
Well, we tend to plant our trees when we're planting them in ornamental situations. We plant them as specimen trees. They're isolated from other trees, which means they're really vulnerable to blowdowns in a storm like you just had. You get the ground saturated with water and big wind, and there's nothing holding the roots there in place. So over they go. That's not particular to oaks, but a big spreading oak can be top heavy, and it's vulnerable to that. So what we're suggesting is that we actually start to plant groves of trees. They don't all have to be the same species, but you plant them young and you plant them close together so that they can interlock their roots the way they would in a forest, and then they become much more stable and reduce that blow down risk quite a bit. When you had, this storm was really, it was a big storm and very tough on all kinds of trees. But oak wood, of course, is very dense, high energy. It's one of the best woods for burning. So if you heat with wood, if you have a wood burning stove, you're in good shape now for several years. So you can get that oak to deliver to your yard. Um, you want to dry it
What
out, of
about
course.
though
You won't be burning it
these
this year,
piles
but
of trees that I'm seeing people waiting to, for the city to come collect? I understand a lot of people just can't have, a big tree trunk sitting in their yard, but perhaps people have some different options to help mitigate future floods by utilizing some of this that has fallen.
plants in general help to reduce the threat of floods. Now, you're in a mountainous area and the storm hit those mountains and dumped all the rain, and there's not too much that a landscaper can do in that situation. But the better your yard is planted, the more resistance it's going to be. If you have downed trees, we call it coarse woody debris. Wood that is on the ground is actually a valuable resource to eastern deciduous forest ecosystems. So uh, you might consider keeping some of that down wood in your yard. Probably not your front yard, but if you have areas in your backyard where you could have it, a lot of biodiversity is associated with fallen logs, from carpenter ants to carpenter bees to just a numerous number of invertebrates that are depending on that wood. So if I were living there, that's what I would do. I would keep as much of the wood on
Thank
site
you.
as possible.
The nature of oaks, I would say that the book seems to be driving at, well, it doesn't seem to be, it's strongly encouraging people to plant oaks in their yards. And all of your books really focus on what we as individuals who take care of property and landscapes can do for nature, well, not so much for nature, but be more in line with nature. And this has become increasingly urgent over the years. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey from this first book, why you wanted to write these books, and how you feel now that they're out in the world, what difference it's making? I think some of the difference we could point to at homegrown national parks. So maybe you'd like to talk about that project as well.
Sure. I started working in this area for a number of reasons. We're in the middle of a very serious biodiversity crisis. We've got climate change, and people think that's the only environmental issue we have, but we also have a biodiversity crisis. And if we had no climate change, we would still have a biodiversity crisis. What do I mean by that? I mean, we're losing the plants and animals that run the ecosystems that provide the life support that keeps us around on this planet. So it's serious business. If you followed the headlines at all, we've got global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. The UN says we're going to lose a million species to extinction in the next 20 years. This is not good. We've got to turn this around. Who's going to turn it around? We have parks and we've got preserves, but all these things are happening anyway. So I think we have to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves, and that's on our private properties. And that makes private property owners the future of conservation, whether they know it or not. We have this idea that we can own a piece of the earth. Well, if we own a piece of the earth, we also own the responsibility of taking care of that piece of the earth. So that's why I've written these books, trying to get people to understand the urgency of the problem and what their role in finding a solution to this problem is. I urge people not to think about the entire planet because that's depressing. But if you just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence, and that's where you live, that's your private property, you can make a difference. And you can see that difference. And much of it starts with the choice of the plants that you put in your yard. Maybe think about reducing the area that you have in lawn. We've got 44 million acres of lawn out there, and that's not accomplishing any of the ecological goals that our landscapes have. So there are real things that homeowners can do. They can watch nature return. You can feel good about that. And it's also why we created what we call homegrown national park. If we cut the area of lawn in half, that would give us 20 million acres that we could restore right at home, which is bigger than all of our major national parks combined. So we call that homegrown national park, and that it would be the biggest park in the country. All you have to do is go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the biodiversity map. So your location and then the amount of area that you're pledging to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the area of lawn. Maybe you're going to plant that oak tree. Maybe you're going to do something as small as put an aster in a flower pot. All of that counts. And then your little piece of your county will light up that where you are with a firefly. That's our little emblem. And of course, the object is to get the entire country to light up. Homegrown National Park is designed to get the message to the people who don't know that they're the future of conservation. We want to get that. We call them the non-choir. And there's millions of them. Yeah. So that we use social media. We use the biodiversity map. It's the states are color coded, so you get to see how well your state's doing. So there's a little bit of competition involved here. But we're trying to use every trick we can think of to educate the general public about their conservation responsibilities.
And so, do you feel like, I mean, I guess if you want to call them tricks, one of them is how I became familiar with you, which was through watching YouTube videos. I'm interested in the native plant societies, and sometimes they might seem a little dry and dull to people, but I've really gotten quite a bit of an education, all kinds of ideas about how to do that type of work where I'm living. I prefer to call myself a custodian. Perhaps part of this idea of private property, is not helpful because we are actually part of a larger um, region, and these problems extend beyond our property lines, of course, so we need to cooperate with each other. And I have to confess, though, that I get really discouraged sometimes. I drive around and I see, lawns everywhere. And, if I try to talk to people about some of these things, they come up with some common objections, which you also talk about in The Nature of Oaks. Maybe we could try to address that for some of our listeners who might be considering for the first time, at least, diversifying their lawn, or I've tried to reduce the lawn around here to pathways and allow wildflowers and other things to come up in whole designated areas that did not get mowed this entire summer. But of course, there's not any 3 foot tree grew this summer in any of those patches. So, what can people, how can they start thinking about this differently to where maybe they would be driving around hoping to see less lawns and more oak trees?
Yeah, well, you've hit on an important point there. I don't talk about getting rid of lawn. I talk about reducing the area that's in lawn. Lawn is the perfect plant to walk on. So wherever you consistently walk, and I know that most people don't walk outside at all. So there's a lot of area we can
It
reduce there.
occurs to me some
But it's
people
also,
don't
we call it a
walk
cue
out
for
because
care.
of the heat
Um,
too, and the trees could actually provide some real cooling
yeah,
effect from the heat, which the lawns tend to reflect. Sorry to interrupt you.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And if you plant that oak, it will reduce the temperature under the oak by 10 degrees, which is substantial. And I know what people think, oh, if I plant an oak, I'm not going to live long enough to enjoy it. And I planted my oaks as acorns, which means they were free. Now it is 23 years later, but those trees are pushing 70 feet tall now. They are real trees. They have reduced the temperature of our property. So you really can turn around the physical nature of where you live by getting some shade into your yard. It doesn't take that long. It doesn't have to be expensive. I encourage you to plant small oaks because they will develop their root system. When you plant a large oak, they have to trim the roots in order
When you
to
say small, you're
move it,
referring to the
or they're
age
growing them in what we call air
of the
pots.
oak. Is that correct? The size.
No, the
Okay.
size,
But I mean, not the ultimate
the size of
size,
the
but
oak.
the size
Yeah.
when you plant it.
Oh, yeah. Now we do have species of oaks that don't get very big. Most of them do get pretty big, and if you have, I mean, that's what's going to give you the shade is a large tree. But if you have a small property and you want a small oak, I would consider Quercus prinoides, which is dwarf chestnut oak, or in your area, Quercus georgiana. It's the Georgia oak is occasionally in the trade. That's also a small species. So there are small species that are available. But if you have the space, don't shy away from the white oak and the red oak and the turkey oak and the chestnut oak. There's a lot of options for you. But back to the lawn, let's use it as a cue for care, meaning the lawn you keep is going to be mowed, it's going to be manicured. You do not have to fertilize it. It'll stay nice and green without that. But it shows that your neighbors that you're fitting in with the culture. You know what the culture is. You're not going to be a rebel. You're not going to reduce property values. You're just going to have less lawn and more plants on your property. And when you approach it that way, it's far less disagreeable to the neighborhood than, there's this idea that if you use native plants, it's wild and messy, and you're not taking care of your yard, and it is going to reduce property values. It's not true at all if you do it properly.
Well, I think one thing I've looked out for, well, for one thing, now that I've allowed that to grow all summer, I have the option to now cut it down and leave it there as mulch, or even to let some of those tall things be purchased for birds who might come along and actually plant some tree seeds there. Um, so it's been kind of fascinating, and I've walked, in there and seen some small trees that actually did come up. I think they were, pig nut hickory and some other things. Not so
That's a good
it's
tree.
that
That's a
in
good tree.
itself can be fascinating to see what's going to come up, and then and so I have a couple different plant identification apps, and it becomes like an adventure to just go out and see, well, what's actually growing out here, which is how I've been able to also identify the oaks that are around as well. So I'm on a larger property. It's like 6.5 acres. But there's people, in the city who have windowsills or rooftops. There's people with a quarter-acre yard. Um, they can still be a part of this regeneration of our ecosystem.
Yeah, 82% of us live in cities, so that's a common challenge. And we have a section on our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, that talks about container gardening for native plants. It will give you the best native plants that do well in containers for your ecoregion. So the person who lives in an apartment, if they put plants out on their balcony, they're going to help pollinators. Pollinators are very, very mobile. They're going to help that migrating monarch. And if everybody in that apartment complex did that, you would take a pile of bricks and turn it into a valuable resource. So the idea that I live in a city and there's nothing I can do, and it's incompatible with nature, it's a challenge, but we can do a lot more with cities than we typically do.
Uh, Doug Tallamy, how can people get in touch? How can they, first of all, find your books, The Nature of Oaks, Bringing Nature Home, and Nature's Best Hope?
Well, the major bookstores carry them. They're of course on Amazon, so that's that's probably the cheapest
We
place to
always
find
like to
them.
encourage people to go to independent bookstores, and I'm sure that they could go there too and ask for your book if it's not actually in the bookstore. Do you have a website where they can go as well?
We don't sell them on the website. The links are there, and again, it's all of our information is on
And how have you found,
homegrownnationalpark.org.
what kind of life has these books taken on? I just wanted to know a little bit about your journey to get them published. And then do you feel like that has helped you to advance this message to people, if this is creating community, or what has been the life of these books?
It's been, it's been far more lively than I ever thought it would be. I wrote Bringing Nature Home. That was the first book. It was a response to questions that people had asked me. I was already giving talks about our research here at the University of Delaware, looking at the impact of invasive species on food webs, on insect decline, on the nature of host plant specialization. Most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch butterfly. So if you take away milkweeds, you lose the monarch. Well, if you take away the native host plants of our all of those caterpillars that the birds need, then you lose the caterpillars and you lose the birds, and everything collapses. Well, we were doing that research, and people were very interested about it. And they said, "What can we read? What can we read?" I said, "There's nothing to read." And finally, I said, "I will
Uh-huh.
write a pamphlet," and the pamphlet became Bringing Nature. So it was really a demand by the public, and that continued. So that led to Nature's Best Hope. We have 3 chapters in Rick Dark's The Living Landscape to give you some visual encouragement. These landscapes can really be beautiful. Then I wrote The Nature of Oaks, and I've got a new one coming out in April called How Can I Help? Which actually answers 499 questions that people have asked me over the years. These are people that have read the books and heard the talks,
Uh
and they
huh.
still have really good questions. So we'll
So
see
they
how
really
that
have taken
in April.
on another life that keeps coming back and fueling the conversation further. We never did get to some of those things that people object to about planting oaks in their yard. Maybe you could address a couple of those before we say our goodbyes here in the audio garden.
Well, one objection is they do make acorns, and the acorns fall down, and people don't like that. I don't know what to say about that. um, Another objection is that they grow too slowly, they get too big. Uh, they really don't grow much more slowly than other plants, particularly if you don't chop off all their roots when you plant them. If you plant them small, they grow quite quickly. They don't have to be giant. He's one of the smaller species. You can even coppice your oak. That means you let it get to a diameter of maybe 2 or 3 inches, then chop it off, and it'll come back as a bush, and it will stay a bush. You just keep chopping off the leader. You can do that for 100 years, so you can actually have oak foliage in a very small yard if you coppice it. So it's life is a trade-off. If you want to really encourage biodiversity in your yard, the best way to do that is to get some oaks in there. If you don't, you should.
Well, if
That's
that's
all
all
I
you
can
can
say.
say, then I guess that's a good place for us to leave it. And I really do appreciate the time that you did spend with us here in the audio garden. Doug Tallamy, professor at the University of Delaware and author of several books, all explaining to you, caretaker of where you live, how you can help to restore our ecology and environment. Thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate the opportunity.